I was bred for adjudication inside the resonant vaults of the Ith-Kar, where memory is not kept in words but in pressure. When I was first coherent, I was lowered into a basin of living stone and surrounded by the verdicts of my ancestors. Their judgments pulsed through the mineral fluid and entered me as stress, rhythm, and weight. Mercy had one pattern. Containment had another. Extermination, when necessary, was the cleanest pattern of all. We did not ask whether a thing was good. We asked whether it preserved continuity. That was the highest condition our civilization knew. By the time I took my place among the corridor measures, I had helped assign penalties to 11 young species, certify 3 reductions, and approve the partition of 2 border ecologies whose populations had become strategically inconvenient. I had never doubted the work. Doubt is a mammalian word, soft-edged and indecisive. We of Ith-Kar do not waver internally. We resonate or we fracture. The galaxy then was old and properly arranged. Near the crowded core, the elder dominions touched one another through threat, tribute, and ritualized war. Between them moved the licensed arteries of commerce, migration, prey, labor, and doctrine. Younger species were bounded where they emerged. Their numbers were managed. Their technologies were measured. If one learned too quickly, it was clipped. If one bred too widely, it was culled. If one became useful, it was shaped. This was not hidden. Hiding has always seemed to us a primitive inefficiency. Order was strongest when declared in forms no one could mistake. Then the humans arrived from the outer darkness. I first encountered them as a file cluster, appended to a jurisdictional query from a Narethi harmonic office. The Narethi had found a new starfaring species on the far rim, beyond routes that mattered, in a sparse margin where dust, cold stars, and indifference stretched for unprofitable distances. The file noted tool competence, moderate territorial spread, high curiosity, and a suspiciously broad record of independent infrastructure for so remote a people. The recommendation was routine: formal recognition, territorial cap, transit restrictions, observational insertion. I reviewed their biological abstracts with the bored attention one gives an unremarkable weather front: warm-blooded, bilateral, internal skeleton. A chemistry of urgency and hormones, brief lives. Dense emotional signaling in face musculature. Solitary bodies with unstable coalition behavior. Like many younger species, they looked improvised. Their envoys came to the ruling convocation 2 cycles later. I had expected either trembling deference or adolescent bluster. Most new civilizations offered one or the other. Instead, the humans were composed, not serene. That would have been false to their kind. They were full of controlled movement, each body always balancing on the edge of action, but their voices remained measured even when informed that the territory they would be allowed to legally occupy was less than half the zone they claimed to inhabit. They listened. They asked very precise questions, not moral questions first. Not the usual young species cries about fairness or destiny. They asked about patrol frequencies on outer routes, about corridor liability in unlicensed dark transit, about the legal thresholds for punitive action, about inspection authority over privately provisioned depots, about the historical basis for developmental caps. It was irritating. I remember one human delegate, gray at the face and hair, asking me how often the corridor measures physically verified marginal charts rather than inheriting older survey assumptions. I told him such questions exceeded his standing. He inclined his head. "Then I withdraw the question," he said. I logged the exchange under procedural insolence. They accepted the cap. That should have ended their significance. The outer rim had produced other latecomers before. Stubborn, provincial species that mistook surviving hardship for strategic importance. They were noticed, bounded, and absorbed into the geometry of old power. I expected the humans to do the same. There were curiosities, certainly. Their official historical record was diffuse in odd places. Whole phases of development seemed padded, as if they had stretched their adolescence across improbably long intervals. Their archaeological evidence was genuine, but their chronology felt cushioned. I noted it. Many species lied about age. Age carried prestige among the vain. More curious was their traffic pattern. Within 30 cycles of recognition, human merchants, analysts, and minor envoys appeared in neglected stations where profit was poor and danger routine. They purchased obsolete survey archives. They contracted corridor salvage rights in dead systems. They hired interpreters for the doctrinal dialects of military species, with whom they had no stated dispute. They attended hearings on sanctions applied to unrelated client peoples. They volunteered aid in plague rings, famine spirals, hull breaches, and civil compartment failures with an eagerness that struck many of us as either sentimental pathology or covert market positioning. The Narethi called them excitable. The Vesk brood envoys called them edible, though this was not always metaphor. I called them provincial meddlers and approved tighter audit language for their transit applications. Years passed, then decades. Human compliance remained outwardly intact. They paid what they were required to pay. They submitted to inspections. They accepted humiliations with a stillness I considered resentment disciplined by weakness. They never erupted properly. They never bowed deeply enough either. At the basin world of Taller Reach, I watched one of their rescue flotillas held outside a quarantine corridor, while a spindle habitat of the Iller dissolved in vacuum. The Iller were translucent float beings adapted to deep fluid pressure. Their communities carried an ocean cylinder whose inner seas sustained entire ancestral song webs. The cylinder had been struck by debris and was venting atmosphere and water. The humans had repair ships within range. The corridor was under elder priority. A Vesk convoy carrying military biomass was due through. Delays were not permitted. The human commander requested 6 standard hours. The Vesk denial came through in secretion code and translated speech. Corridor precedence overrides non-productive losses. The humans remained outside the line while the cylinder split open. Billions of liters flashed into crystals and vapor. Iller bodies, made for internal sea, tore under pressure change and spun glittering around the wreck. Human comm traffic went quiet for 17 minutes after the last life signs failed. I thought at the time that the lesson was useful. Younger species often required public reminders that distress did not alter hierarchy. The first time I felt unease was over a colony called Saravan Coil. It was a human-built habitat complex in a sparse metal-rich system, allocated to them only in temporary exploitation, pending elder review. A Vesk brood claim overrode that allotment. Such reversals were common. Ownership flowed toward force or old title. The humans protested through channels. The channels naturally favored the Vesk. The brood ships descended before final notice was even delivered. They seeded the atmosphere processors with corrosive organisms to force evacuation and gave the population 8 hours to clear structural zones. Human-civilian traffic clogged local space. Their defense ships remained powered down, exactly as ordered. I watched the feed expecting panic, sabotage, perhaps a futile strike born of mammalian attachment to place. Instead, the evacuation was almost elegant. Shelter priorities, medical triage, data extraction, children first, heavy machine cores last. Their officers spoke in calm tones, while Vesk landing organisms dissolved half a city's support lungs beneath them. There should have been rage. There was but hidden. I saw it only in fragments. a medic whose hands shook while she carried an unconscious child through sulfur vapor, a dockmaster who looked once at the burning ridge and then turned away with such visible effort that even I, who do not read faces naturally, felt the force of restraint. It did not look like surrender, it looked selected. I submitted my report with a note. Human tolerance for strategic insult appears unusually disciplined. Recommend observation for deferred response behavior. The recommendation was archived and ignored. Our order ignored many things because our age had taught us contempt for anomalies. Old systems survived by classifying warning as noise. The Keth arrays burned 21 cycles later. The Keth were a distributed photonic species, dwelling in shade webs around a dim giant star. Their minds lived across millions of ribbon organisms that shared memory through patterned light, fragile physically, dangerous mathematically, restricted of course. Their fabrication abilities had been capped generations before. Humans had been visiting them, officially for medical exchange and habitat stabilization, unofficially, who can say? The humans always wrapped motives inside service. A Narethi audit uncovered unauthorized technical transfer. Pumps shielding methods, adaptive repair swarms. Small things by human argument, developmental contamination by ours. The correction was approved at the level below mine. I reviewed it only after implementation. 3 Vesk enforcement vessels and a Narethi adjudication choir entered the Keth system and ordered surrender of all advanced matrices, plus a tenth of the Keth reproductive substrate for culling. The Keth refused. Their refusal came not in speech, but in a starflicker pattern so dense the translation engine reduced it to a single phrase: "We are alive." The Elder Force ignited their shade habitats one by one. I watched because such events were educational. That is what I would have said then. The habitats unfurled in fire, light sails becoming sheets of white plasma, memory ribbons curling and vanishing. Human ships were present at range, held back by legal warning and superior guns. They did not charge. They did not plead after the first denial. They watched. One human vessel transmitted a single type band burst toward the burning webs. We never decoded it. Afterward, human attendance at our hearings changed, not in number, in density. They began sending observers to cases involving species they had no trade with. They asked for records on historical reductions. They requested casualty data from cull actions old enough to have become ritual precedent. They were building a picture. I knew it and still believed the picture could not help them. Then came their moral language. It arrived slowly enough that many elder institutions dismissed it as a juvenile phase. Human delegates began objecting, in formal assembly, not merely to specific penalties, but to the principles beneath them. They used words our translation matrices struggled with because our civilization had no native equivalents for them except as pathologies: reciprocity, inherent sovereignty, universal law, protection of the weak as obligation rather than discretionary ornament. The chamber responses ranged from amusement to offense. I was offended. Not because I felt accused, though I was. Because the humans spoke as if moral claim could exist independently of power history. To an Ith-Kar adjudicator, this was madness. Authority arose from continuity and capacity to enforce. What else could law be? Their argument seemed less like rebellion than contamination, a soft-minded infection that, if indulged, would dissolve the hard geometries by which civilizations survived. Still, there was danger in their rhetoric. Younger species listened. Some listened with the stunned stillness of beings hearing forbidden weather for the first time. I spoke against them in convocation. I remember the exact pattern of my own pressure speech, because later I replayed it in shame. I argued that humans confused appetite with ethics, that they mistook their recent emergence for innocence, that their proposals would unleash unbounded expansion and species chaos. I recommended a public corrective demonstration before the infection spread. The corrective did not take long to choose. The humans had established a major licensed habitat chain in the inner lanes, far from the neglected outer dark, where most of their kind still clustered. Its legal standing was impeccable. That was why it was chosen. If law itself became the instrument of punishment, the lesson would deepen. The place was called Meridian Shelves, a long architecture of rotating habitats, agricultural rings, docks, and cultural vaults around a white star. Hundreds of millions of humans lived there. So did protected populations from younger species who had sought human patronage. The station complex sat on chartered lanes under elder guarantee. We voided the guarantee. The ruling declaration cited destabilizing doctrinal agitation, unauthorized cross-species shielding, and strategic insolence. I helped draft the phrasing. Even now, I can feel the calm precision of the legal mesh as I shaped it. The words made slaughter sound inevitable, hygienic, almost sorrowful. A combined enforcement fleet entered Meridian Shelves under full witness protocols. Broadcast recorders from half the inner powers were present. The point was not destruction alone, it was instruction. The human governor appealed immediately. She cited charter law, corridor covenants, civilian density, and the non-combatant status of the populations under her protection. Her voice shook only once. The reply from our side was formal. Continuity nullifies guarantees where obedience fails. Then the fleet closed the exits and executed reduction. Habitats spun open to vacuum under field inversion. Agricultural rings were set ablaze. Docked civilian transports fused inside their berths. Emergency sanctuaries were targeted after thermal clustering exposed them. White gas plumes erupted from torn hulls and expanded into sunlight full of debris and bodies. The protected non-human enclaves died with the humans because distinction would have weakened the example. I remember feeling not pleasure but resolution. A harsh correction, yes, but stabilizing, necessary. History had often required uglier acts. When it was done, nearly 500 million humans were dead. The galaxy waited for the response we all understood. Petitions, grief displays, enraged but futile mobilization, factional collapse, bargaining. That was the script. Punished species either broke into servility or lashed out blindly and gave us justification for deeper reduction. Humanity did neither. They went silent. Not at once in every place, but with a coordination that soon became unmistakable. Embassies sealed. Delegates departed hearings without speeches. Human traders abandoned contracts and vanished from licensed routes. Technical advisors left client worlds, often after transferring encrypted archives to local authorities. Human neighborhoods on mixed stations emptied with eerie speed. Schools closed. Data vaults were erased or taken. Children disappeared first, then medical stores, then machine cores, then everyone else. Traffic records should have revealed panic. Instead, they showed design. At first, the dominant ministries declared success. We had broken them, they said. Shame and demographic loss had driven them inward. Their silence was exhaustion. But the silence wrong-footed our interpretation machinery. Expected messages did not arrive. No surrender terms were requested, no mercy delegations. No leadership disputes for us to exploit. Human market signatures did not fragment, they ceased. Outer rim reports became contradictory. Some stations registered sudden shortages of high-grade human alloys. Others reported abandoned depots stripped clean. Long-range scans picked up odd energy blooms in dead systems beyond mapped commercial value. then lost them again. I raised the alarm formally. By then I had moved from irritation to something more corrosive. I could not name it in Ith-Kar pressure patterns, because our civilization has no inherited term for fear of the underestimated. We fear known mass, known hunger, known physics. Humans have become a shape in the dark, whose edges no doctrine described. My memorandum argued that their withdrawal suggested strategic concentration beyond recognized territory. I cited their years of logistical curiosity, their too calm compliance, their padded developmental history, their unusual attention to elder vulnerabilities. I recommended immediate deep survey of outer margins before any punitive expedition advanced. The reply from the upper resonance was dismissive. Margin expansion on meaningful scale by a species so young was impossible. The outer dark lacked density, value, and historical precedent. Humans, I was told, were dramatizing injury and would submit once secondary sanctions tightened. So the punitive armada launched. It was enormous by accepted standards. Vesk brood clusters, Narethi harmonic command spindles, Ith-Kar corridor breakers, Thune relay guardians, enough force to cauterize a rebellious frontier and remind every listening species that the old powers still determine the shape of tomorrow. It traveled toward the human outer allotment expecting frightened stations, improvised defenses, and scattered resistance. Even as it crossed the mid-lanes, we still did not know. I was in the core archive around VHAL-OS, reviewing delayed telemetry from abandoned human sectors, when the first Outer Rim combat packets arrived. At first, the data looked corrupted. The punitive vanguard entered what our charts still marked as sparse human frontier and encountered layered sensor ghosts, false beacons, minefields hidden inside gravitational noise, and defense formations too large to have been assembled under any registered industrial capacity. Human ships emerged from cold shadow in numbers that did not fit the population and production models on which our entire strategic posture rested. Then more lights came on. Across the outer darkness, stars we had treated as empty flared with industrial signatures. Dust-shrouded systems bloomed into shipyards. Rogue planets lit internal foundries. Comet swarms unfolded into fabrication lattices. Vast power arrays, masked for decades beneath thermal veils, ignited almost simultaneously across territories no elder survey had considered worthy of sustained scrutiny. It was like discovering that the blank margin of a map was a hidden sky. The Armada pushed deeper anyway. Doctrine left it no alternative, and doctrine killed it. Human warcraft did not fight as younger species were supposed to fight. They did not cling to single worlds or fixed corridors. They flowed. Distributed groups separated, vanished into fold geometries our sensors dismissed as noise, and reappeared on impossible vectors. Their command nets functioned even after nodes were destroyed because no node was sacred. Local initiative did not create chaos, it multiplied coherence. They had achieved what our oldest strategists called unstable and therefore unattainable. At far lattice, an Ith-Kar breaker group attempted corridor lock against a cluster of human-heavy units. The humans let the lock form. Then their ships translated through a sheer layer our models had classed as unusable, emerging inside our own geometry. Corridor pressure reflected. 3 breaker spines folded inward like crushed raid tubes. I listened to their final resonance crack across the feed and understood, for the first time in my life, that we were not the highest form in the room. At Karin Verge, Vesk broodships committed to a decapitation thrust against what they believed was the central human yard. It was an empty shell around dispersed production. Human inverters turned the broodships, shielding logic against itself. 17 crucibles imploded within seconds, Their internal war organisms flash-cooked inside armor that had become a sealed furnace. The Narethi tried to restore control through harmonic unification. Humans blanketed the battlespace with false consensus echoes and gravitic clutter. Narethi command choirs, so elegant in normal war, began issuing contradictory directives to themselves. Entire spindle clusters drifted mute, while human strike craft carved them apart. The punitive armada did not merely fail. It disintegrated under assumptions it did not know it carried. Then concealment ended completely. The outer rim became a furnace of mobilization. Hidden fleets streamed inward. Industrial signatures multiplied beyond any plausible emergency reserve. This was not a desperate frontier species that had somehow overprepared. This was a second civilization concealed beneath the first, one that had spent decades learning us while pretending to be small. The realization spread through the elder systems like poison. All at once our maps were wrong. Our census of power was wrong. Our chronology of human development was almost certainly false. Their padded history, which I had filed as vanity, had been camouflage. Their questions had not been provincial curiosity, but reconnaissance. Their restraint under insult had not been weakness but timing. And we had taught them everything we could by ruling over them in public. The younger species saw it too. The first revolts began before our ministries could even issue revised statements. Tributary fleets refused summons. Labor populations sabotaged relay hubs. Species we had culled, partitioned, sterilized, and humiliated for ages erupted wherever our garrisons had grown thin. Some openly requested alliance with humanity. Others needed no invitation. They had been waiting only for proof that waiting could end. The war that followed was not the one we had planned for. It was wider and morally clearer than any doctrine of ours could process. Humanity did not sweep inward as a new devouring empire. That would have been legible. It would have reassured me in a broken way, because it would have made them only another elder species in rapid bloom. Instead, they fought with a discipline more terrible to us than cruelty. They targeted brood foundries, cull stations, tribute depots, corridor chokepoints, sterilization arrays, command vaults, and the monopolies by which the old powers had strangled everyone else. They announced evacuation windows where possible. They opened corridors for subject populations. They broadcast records of our crimes as they advanced. On worlds where our garrisons hid inside dependent populations, human fleets altered attack plans at cost to themselves rather than burn through the vulnerable and call it necessity. Their rage was not lessened by precision. It was made vast by it. I fled Vihal As when the third relay shell failed. Around me, the old machinery of certainty came apart in layers. Client species stopped answering directives. Internal sanctions could no longer be enforced because enforcement fleets had been recalled or destroyed. Sacred legal forms lost force the moment no one feared them. For the first time in my existence, I saw elder functionaries not merely defeated but irrelevant. I reached the inner fortress cluster of Suthra Line with other displaced adjudicators and watched the last grand rally of the old order assemble. It was pathetic in scale compared to our myths, and still formidable beyond anything the younger galaxy had once dared imagine. Ancient stations with weapon geometries traced before human agriculture. Narethi harmonic continents of crystal mist. Vesk warclades swollen to ruinous size. Ith-Kar pressure citadels like dark mountains in orbit. Thune memory vaults turning slowly in escort halos. The summons went out to every tributary, every client, every constrained civilization preserved under our care. Preserve continuity, it commanded. Defend civilization against human disorder. Many did not answer. Some answered with mutiny. I stood in the resonance chamber as reports arrived that former subject crews had seized our targeting webs. That corridor sentinels once manned by bound labor species had switched transponder loyalty and opened channels to human fleets. That Keth survivor swarms, thought functionally extinct, were blinding our sensors in patterns evolved from the burning of their homes. That iller migrant clusters were towing mines into our retreat lanes with the patient hatred of the bereaved. Then the humans came. Their drives broke every approach geometry we had sanctified. Their formations did not resemble ours or any accepted younger derivative. They arrived in staggered depths, layered by purpose rather than prestige, each group independent enough to survive disruption and linked enough to strike as one. Allied species advanced with them, not beneath them. The battle lasted 11 days. By the 4th, half the Suthra fortresses were blind. By the 7th, the Vesk had lost brood cohesion and turned on one another in command collapse. By the 9th, a human spear penetrated the outer shell of the Ith-Kar Citadel, where I had once believed judgment itself to reside beyond challenge. On the 10th day, one of our remaining high resonance proposed activation of dormant sterilization lattices against the surrounding systems. Better a dead belt than a conquered core, he signaled. Continuity through subtraction. The command never completed. Technicians from 3 subject species, hidden for years inside our own maintenance organs, cut the lattice control from within and opened every internal channel. The entire fortress heard the intercepted records of our reductions, culls, territorial seizures, and corrective massacres played back in sequence, while human breaching charges walked through our armored spine. That was the moment the Empire truly died. Not when our stations burned. Not when our fleets broke. When our justifications failed in our own hearing. I survived because surrender protocols finally overrode annihilation reflex in the chamber where I lay half-buried under collapsed pressure stone. Human soldiers entered wearing sealed black armor, marked with symbols I did not know. They did not kill me. One of them looked at me through a mirrored faceplate, while Allied med units moved through the rubble separating living from dead. Later I learned that the elder species were not exterminated, demilitarized, partitioned, placed under external oversight, strategic monopolies dismantled, punishment systems seized, certain castes tried. Others disassembled, where personhood was collective and weaponized beyond recovery. Containment turned back upon those who had perfected it. There were voices calling for our extinction. No one who understands what we did should find those voices surprising. Meridian Shelves alone would have justified a hatred measured in species. But humanity did not make itself our replacement. Instead, they shattered the architecture that had allowed any one civilization to hold the rest hostage. New law spread outward from the ruins. No enforced developmental caps by dominant powers, no tribute under terror, no sterilization sovereignty, no exclusive control of corridors sufficient to starve a people into obedience. Imperfect rules, contested rules, young rules, real ones. I live now in a bounded mineral sea, under supervision of 3 species, my civilization, once classified as manageable. My judgments are requested only as historical testimony. I give them. When I first heard of humans, I thought them a trivial disturbance from an unimportant edge, late to a galaxy already decided. I thought age was authority, endurance was innocence, and power accumulated long enough became legitimacy. I thought cruelty, formalized and repeated over millennia, transformed into necessity. I was wrong in all structures. The humans had reached the stars alone, beyond our sight, in a darkness we considered strategically empty. We mistook that emptiness for lack. We mistook their restraint for weakness. We mistook their questions for naivete. We mistook their moral speech for childish disease because we had lived so long inside domination that we no longer recognized judgment when it stood before us. When they finally struck, they did not merely defeat our fleets, they rendered a verdict. And across the once neglected rim, where our charts had shown only marginal dark, the lights still burn, too many to count, too distant to contain and free in a way my people, for all our age, never understood until we had lost everything.